you all to all of you for coming today. Oops, sorry, just making sure I've got my right screen. Thank you for being here today. It's great to see a bunch of you have your cameras on. I know doing our virtual world stuff, it's not the same as being in person and being able to interact face to face with one another, but it's great to see that there are some smiling faces out there on the other side of the virtual world. As you know, my name is Laura Gaspard, so I'm a social worker with the Advanced Care Planning team in Fraser Health, and I cover the Fraser South region, supporting both healthcare providers as well as the public. We have got Nicole and Sherry here with me, who's helping today, and they support the Fraser East. So today we're going to talk about advanced care planning and all that comes with how to start thinking about decision-making within your healthcare in advance before you actually become unwell. Just before we get started, I'd like to take this moment just to pause and reflect and think about all those wonderful spaces that we have around us. I know today where I am, it's bright and sunny and warm. I was able to take my dog out for a walk over the lunch break, and he's so hot, he's rolling around in the grass, and it's bright green and cool for him. So I know I'm very, very grateful that we have these special spaces that are bright and fresh and still wild, whereas there's lots of places in the world where it's not quite as wild as what we have here. So I give thanks to the Katzie, Tsawwassen, Stolo, Kwantlen, and Musqueam peoples who it's their traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories in which that I reside on. All right, so what we're going to cover today. So today, there's kind of 4 different topics that we'll cover all around advanced care planning. Really, it's about the who, what, where, why, how. So starting off with, what is advanced care planning? Why do we want to do it? We're going to walk you through some of the 5 steps. Some of you might have heard of the 5 steps of advanced care planning. It might be new for some of you, and that's okay. So we'll go through the how-to, and within that how-to, we'll be able to give you some tips and tricks, especially when we're trying to have conversations with people. And then a little bit about the resources that we have available to help you actually make some tangible directions for yourself, not just listening to us talk at your faces and then walk away and not know what to do next. So how many here have actually heard of advanced care planning before? Well, we've got some hands raised. So this isn't new for you guys, which is great. And it looks like it might be new for some of you. I'm not sure about the people who aren't on camera right now, but it otherwise seems fairly common for the rest of Canada. There has been some research done by ACP Canada, just to see who has been participating in advanced care planning, thinking about advanced care planning, who has actually had conversations with family, their healthcare providers. And actually what the research showed was that about 80% of Canadians are already thinking about this type of stuff. They're thinking about their healthcare, how they want to live, what would be appropriate in terms of living their life down the road if they did become unwell. But when more questions were asked, there was actually very, very few people who actually had a concrete plan in place. Many had actually had those conversations with families, but nothing was necessarily concretely written down or shared with their healthcare providers. So even though all this great information was being shared close to home, there was a bit of a disconnect with the healthcare system. And as healthcare providers, we do take a bit of ownership of that, because one of the biggest barriers that the feedback was is that healthcare providers were not asking you people of the public some of these questions around that planning. So we're working with healthcare providers as well to try to bridge that gap so that members of the public, when they come in and work with their healthcare providers, they're armed and ready for these conversations, and then also the healthcare providers are there to have those conversations as well. In the end, when there's a crisis, that's not the time to start making those important decisions when everyone's feeling very chaotic, emotions are high. If we don't have this information on hand, it can be really distressing to try to figure out what is the quote unquote right thing to do going forward for that person who needs the healthcare. So when we are talking about advanced care planning, we're thinking about a bit of the, why do we do it? And our team, we likes to think of advanced care planning as just any other type of planning. Like lots of us do financial planning, we have our money, and thinking about how do we want to manage this money for the future in the now. So that might be planning for retirement, or looking at your retirement funds and figuring out how is my lifestyle going to look with what I have. Some people, depending on their life stage, they might be trying to save up for a house, or RESP, so looking at education. We also do lots of planning around our belongings too, so more of that estate planning, so writing out wills, determining who has our things. My parents, they're starting to downsize, and so they're going through all their stuff and trying to get rid of some of it and figuring out what can we give to the kids, what do we hang on to after we're gone, what do we just get rid of. So all this planning to do with belongings. So the same thing is with healthcare. It's just planning in advance for that moment in time that you end up going into the healthcare system, and being able to determine what is acceptable for that healthcare, and what would be acceptable for the healthcare treatments that you do receive versus something that maybe does not fit with you as an individual. Because then ultimately, advanced care planning is this lifelong process. We do try to encourage people ages 19 and older to participate in this process that is revisited over and over again. Although we do also encourage people who are more mature youth as well. So maybe those teenagers who are learning about who they are as people, learning about what their values are. Those are all important things to think about in this process for everyone. And so encouraging people even younger than the age of 19 to participate in this process. So it is this ongoing thing that you want to revisit multiple times throughout your life as things start to change. Maybe there's a different event that happens. So it's always good to go back and revisit that plan. But it's thinking about those personal values, the beliefs that you have. How do you like to live? What helps you get up in the morning? What makes you you? And being able to then share that with the people around you, so that if you touch in on the healthcare system, that information is shared with the healthcare team, and they can try and align the treatment options that are being offered to you with who you are as a person, how you want to live. Whether there's a surgery that is being offered to you, and let's say that you want to still be able to eat chocolate and go for bike rides, and so you can talk to the surgeon and be like, okay, if I take this surgery, can I still eat chocolate and go for bike rides? And the surgeon has a better idea of where you can go and what your options are going forward with that medical treatment option. So we'll dive into the 5 steps. And I know this looks very, very linear. This is the 5 steps of advanced care planning that was developed by ACP Canada. Just for simplicity's sake, we're going through this linearly, but it is meant to be more of a circular process. So something that you revisit multiple times throughout your life. You don't have to start with step 1, even though we do have step 1 through 5. If it makes sense more for you to start somewhere in the middle, that's okay, and you can bounce around. But the steps are think, so that's more of an internal reflection process where you're thinking about who you are as a person, and what makes you you, what brings your life meaning, purpose, and joy. And then learn. So that's more of an external reflection. So you're thinking about how do you like to communicate? That's in terms of decision making and how much information that you'd like to receive when you're touching in on the healthcare system. You also want to learn about what health conditions you do have and what that means for you in the future. And then also learning about some of the laws in your area that you live. So for us specifically, some of the laws in British Columbia that impact you when you are touching in on the healthcare system. And then the next step is decide. So this is about figuring out who would be that spokesperson if you weren't able to speak for yourself. So if I went into the healthcare system and I didn't determine, there's a very specific person in my world that I wanted to speak on my behalf, who would that be based on the law? Because there is a fallback plan that the law has laid out for people. Talk, that's pretty self-explanatory. So that's, taking all this information from the previous steps, spreading it like glitter, and sharing this information with as many people in your world as possible. And then record. So again, a little more self-explanatory, being able to, whether it's writing it down on paper, recording it through video or audio, just getting that information into a tangible place so that it can be picked up by others if you are unable to speak for yourself. So I'm just going to check the chat. There's the question, can a power of attorney speak for you? That's a great question, and we will touch on that in a little bit. So hang on to that thought, just in case we're not clear about that, but good question. So I'm going to start with step 1 with think, and I'll talk to you about learn as well, and then I will pass it on to Sherry to go through the other steps. Sherry or Nicole, is there anything else you'd like to add before I keep going forward?
No, not for me so far.
No? Okay, great. All right, so the step 1 think, as I said before, it's thinking about who you are as a person. So what are your values? What brings you joy throughout your day? And when we talk about values, I know that's kind of a loaded statement because if I just walked up to you and said, hey, what are your values? It probably would be kind of a tough thing to think about on the spot. But when we're talking about values, really, it's right down to how you decide to live your life every single day. So from the time you wake up, what do you have to eat during the day, what career you've chosen, the type of friends that you're around, those are all behaviors that are guided by our values. So our values is kind of like our internal compass. So those are the types of things we want to think about in terms of who we are as individuals. Other things to think about, what brings your life meaning, purpose, and joy, which I believe I've mentioned as well. What is a great day? What do you do for fun? So just an example for myself, I mentioned my dog earlier. Depends on the day. Sometimes he brings me joy, sometimes he brings me utmost stress, but I do like to spend my time with him, and we enjoy going for runs outdoors in the sunshine. So for me, that brings my life meaning, especially outside of work. I have my purpose, keeping my animal alive while he still on most days gives me joy. and spending that time outside, moving my body, being in the fresh air. Those are all things that I very much value, and I hope ends up being taken into account if I ever go into the hospital system. Because ultimately, those values, it's going to help guide us in how those healthcare treatments are going to support how we live. So for instance, there was a woman that I worked with at the last job I was in before I had this job. And she lived in kind of a rural place just outside of the main city that I was working in, and needed to travel in 3 times a week to receive dialysis. But it was a huge process. It would take hours for her to get ready because she was getting weaker. She needed to come in by bus, so that would be hours more during the day, and then she'd be exhausted in these days in between the treatment. And so what was being offered to her to try to ease some of that, the exhaustion and some of just the overall stress of trying to get to these treatments, was she was being offered to go and live in long-term care that provided support with dialysis instead of living in her hometown. So there was a lot of conversations around that. And what ultimately came from that is we found out her values really reflected around her connection with her community, being close to her family, her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, being able to go outside, even if it was a bit of a struggle, to even just sit in the sunshine. She lived close to the mountains. There's a lot of animals near her place. And so that really brought her joy and meaning throughout her week. So even though she knew that things were just going to keep going downhill, her energy wasn't going to be high and there'd be a lot of struggles, her values said that she would prefer to live that way than being in a long-term care home where she would be a little more dependent on people to help her get outside. She'd be disconnected from her community unless people came to visit her. So in the end, the decision was not to move her because that was what quality of life looked like for her. Any questions around that before I move on? No? Okay. So this next step is learns. This, as I said, is more of an external reflection. At learning a lot about what is going on with your health, being able to apply it and maybe reflect back to how it impacts that step one, think some of those values and things. Because ultimately, the hope is at least that the more information that we have, or maybe if there's different information, we might make different decisions. We don't know, depending on how much information we have. Things might impact our values a little bit differently based on how much information that we have at the time. So the 3 main key areas when we're in this section of learn is that communication piece. So how do I like to make decisions, and how much information do I like to know about my health? So for example, for myself, I'm fairly individualistic. I do like to make decisions myself, but I might also reach out to people I care about in my world to help me with the processing of information. But some people, they have maybe a family spokesperson, or maybe they just don't like to make decisions. They want to involve other people. And in some cultures, even they have a community spokesperson that is chosen by the whole community who supports that person as they're going through the healthcare system. So that's important information to know about yourself and how things are done, and be able to communicate that to your healthcare provider. Same with how much information you want to know about your health. I'm someone who likes to know as much as possible, but not everyone's like that. Some people don't want to know anything. Some people want to know just a little bit. Everyone's a little bit different. Understanding your health. So if you have been diagnosed with a specific health condition, this is where we want to learn about how is this health condition going to impact my life. So, what does this health condition look like in a year from now? What can I expect in 5 and 10 years from now? If my health starts to go downhill, what do I expect as things start to change for me? I want to learn about what are some of those treatment options that are on the table for me. If I'm not happy with those treatment options, what other options might there be for me? So being able to listen to our gut and think, okay, is there actually another option here? Having that conversation with your healthcare provider. And disclaimer, don't do what I do and look at Dr. Google. That is a rabbit hole that is never fun and doesn't really do much for us. But always good to go to our healthcare provider and ask more specific questions around that instead. But also asking, if these treatment options don't seem to align with who I am as a person, what can I expect if I decide to do nothing? Nothing is always an option as well. And then as well, if we have decided to take a specific treatment, what's it going to look like and what happens next if that particular treatment is no longer working? Is there another treatment that would be available down the road, or just what is to be expected at that point in time? And then the last piece is around the law. So this is mostly to do with the legal decision maker, so the spokesperson, and Sherry will go into more detail about this in the next section. But understanding, okay, what legal documents are there and available for me? Which ones do I need to go to a lawyer for? Which ones can I just have witness's signature for me rather than spending all of this money on a lawyer? And if I decide not to fill out any documents, which is totally within your right, who is that fallback person that the law has laid out on my behalf? Who would that end up being, and would I be okay with that person? So the 3 main legal documents that are available around what would be considered advanced care planning is we've got our enduring power of attorney, our representation agreement, and our advance directive. I do want to make a note that because healthcare is provincially run across Canada, the names of these documents are going to be different all across the country, and obviously different than in the States. So you might hear different names that are described that sound like they describe the exact same document, but it could be terminology that is from a different jurisdiction. So our enduring power of attorney, that is to do with finances only, finances and legal decisions. So this sometimes ends up coming into play in our healthcare system more. Like I used to deal with this, I used to work in long-term care. So that would be more to do with that publicly funded space for someone to live, but they still needed to pay some fees to live in long-term care. So that's where the enduring power of attorney would come into play within healthcare. But if in terms of consenting to treatment, the enduring power of attorney is not involved in that process. That can be sometimes confusing because we might have family, or maybe we ourselves come from places like Ontario, where they've got an enduring power of attorney for finances and an enduring power of attorney for health. And so that can be very, very confusing, but in BC, this is separate. So the document that is intended for healthcare decision making. So if, for example, if I'm unable to speak for myself for whatever reason, then that representation agreement would be a person that I've designated to be that person to speak on my behalf during that time that I can't speak for myself. So they deal with saying yes or no to treatments that are being offered to me on my behalf. And then the advance directive is just basically a record page. You can find both the representation agreement and advance directive in the provincial My Voice yellow booklet. That is very big. It's a 53-page saga, but is a great tool if you're okay with a bit of light reading at bedtime. The advance directive is where you would write specific instructions. Usually it's a refusal. For instance, maybe you're a person that has been going through a lot of different treatments, and at a certain point you're just like, you know what, I can't go through another round of chemo, or I can't go through another experience, maybe with a ventilator, something to do with your respiration. Then you can say, you know, I don't want to do this again. It's not going to bring any quality to your life. Some people also use it to say that they don't want any blood byproducts in case they need a blood transfusion, something like that. And then, so the enduring power of attorney and representation agreement is what we call like the full meal deal, the full package. You've got someone to deal with your finances, someone to deal, you know, just in case with your healthcare decisions. The enduring power of attorney, you do have to go to a lawyer because it's to do with finances. The representation agreement, you don't have to go to a lawyer for. You can if you'd wish. Many lawyers have packages to do all of the different documents together with, but if finances are an issue or you think your situation isn't overly complicated, you can have two witnesses for that document instead. And the same with the advance directive. You don't need to go to a lawyer for that, just need witnesses, and hopefully there's conversations with your healthcare provider if you're writing an advance directive. All right, any questions about that? You see there's a question in the comment box, can you do a rep agreement yourself? So yes, you can do the representation agreement yourself. That's where I said you can find a copy of the template in the My Voice booklet, the yellow My Voice booklet. You'd probably want to do the representation agreement 9. So there will be a 7 and a 9 in the booklet. The 9 is more of the you know, the holistic right to the end of life decision making. And again, you can have two witnesses for that instead of going to a lawyer. Does that answer your question, Joan? Yep, great, great. Okay, any other questions?
Quick question. What is that 53-page booklet you had mentioned?
Yes, the My Voice. Now, where did I store my Voice booklet? Or Sherry, do you have one here?
I've always got it handy. Looks like this. And yeah, it's as Laura was saying, it's got a lot of information in there, and some people might find this, you know, helpful, and it certainly, you know, kind of covers everything comprehensively. But most of us, even healthcare providers, find it to be just, you know, overwhelming amounts of information. So we actually developed something called My Voice in Action workbook, which we will touch on at the very end of the presentation, that takes a lot of this information, but it's much more user friendly. But as Laura mentioned, and since you brought it up, Joan, asking about the rep agreement and whether you can do it by yourself, as Laura said, there is some the advance directive and the rep agreements and information about, more detailed information about them, that you can actually fill out yourself. So that's where this booklet is kind of most helpful. But again, as Laura said, not very user friendly. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
And can I just mention, I learned just yesterday that for enduring power of attorney, if there's no property involved, then you do not need to have a lawyer do it. You would do it with two witnesses, just like the rep agreement and the advance directive. But if you do have any property, then you would want to go through a lawyer to do that.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole. I just learned that right now. Perfect.
Okay, are you ready, Laura? You're all wrapped up? Good. Okay, so hello, everybody. Again, my name is Sherry and I'm a social worker as well on this team. I just cover a different area of Fraser Health. So I'm out in the east area of Fraser Health. So I'm going to be talking to you for the next half hour here. I'm hoping I'll be mindful of the time. I've even set my little timer, so you might hear it in the background, just to kind of cue me so that we have a little bit of time for questions left over at the end. But I certainly encourage and welcome questions throughout, because sometimes we forget if we don't ask questions right at the moment. So please go ahead and use the chat as Joan has as well. So I'm certainly open to that. It's lots of information that we're presenting today. And I did want to just briefly say too, that I'm going to be talking to you in the next couple of slides here about what Laura has already mentioned a little bit around temporary substitute decision makers. Or substitute decision makers, and I'll explain that a little bit more, but that would be, of course, a person that would be making decisions for you if for some reason you were not able to make your own healthcare decisions. And so when I kind of talk about that a little bit, I would encourage you to think about your own circumstances as we kind of go through the list a little bit as it pertains to you in your own personal life. Because as much as we highlight and talk about the rep agreement, for example, that is not something that everybody necessarily has to do. So it can certainly be useful, and I hope that I explain that well enough as we go through. But I also want to just kind of highlight for folks as well that it's not necessarily a document that everybody needs to leave here today and run out and grab a copy of the book and get going on it. So I'll touch on those things in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about, again, substitute decision makers, and that person, that individual would be your voice, essentially. That would be a person, of course, that would be making that decision for you if for some reason you were not able to communicate it. So one of the things that we encourage you to kind of think about, and I was hoping to ask this question of you guys today, is what kinds of qualities would you want that person to have? So not necessarily the who in terms of, well, that would of course be my husband, or that would be my cousin, or that would be this person. It's more about the kinds of personal qualities or attributes that you would want in that person. If you took a minute and you imagined, again, yourself in a situation, perhaps it's even a temporary situation, which actually I think happens more often than most of us realize. That could be just a situation where a medication has caused us to be temporarily unable to communicate or make a healthcare decision for ourselves if it was necessary. So there's lots of different scenarios that actually do present that most of us don't really think about, wherein we could be in this situation. So so thinking about that, I'm wondering if some of you are obviously familiar with the chat here. I'm wondering if someone either just wants to unmute themselves and volunteer a thought, or add something into the chat around that question. What would be a personal quality that you would want in someone who is going to essentially be your voice and communicate with healthcare providers about an important medical treatment? Anyone have any thoughts or ideas? What comes to mind?
I don't have a medical provider at the moment. My doctor just retired and left everyone hanging. And so the center was in Langley and there was no one to take over. So I'm still waiting to get a doctor. I'm 88 years in a couple of days. So it's probably very necessary. We're having a problem in BC with doctors, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. That's unfortunately, like you have said, it's unfortunately not that uncommon to be in that situation, but that certainly is a worrisome one for sure.
Well, I've applied to a medical clinic on 16th Avenue that just opened, and there's a new doctor there. But my daughter did the same thing, and she has an appointment in September.
goodness. Wow.
So I don't know when I'll see this new doctor. Fingers
Yeah.
crossed that
Well,
everything keeps moving.
Thank you for that, Carl. Absolutely. Yeah. And I fingers crossed for sure, because I know it's certainly a big issue for lots of folks. And that's sort of a reflection of the change in some ways over time, because again, so many of us have had long-term family doctors, and not always, but often there's a different relationship that comes about. A sense of comfort in them knowing you and you knowing them. So it's hard to be in a situation where that's a bit more tenuous. So I wish you well in that regard.
Thank you.
So I'm just looking through the chat, and I see some folks have popped a few things in there. Compassionate, willing to deal with the medical system. Excellent. Thank you, Bridget. Corey, to respect my decision regardless of theirs. Excellent. And we will be talking about just that very thing. And Marco has agreed with Corey. Yeah, because that's a really important one we'll touch on. And that you know the person very well. And so those are some great ones. One of the things that comes up for a lot of folks as well, similar to what a lot of you have highlighted again, is things like, are they a good advocate? Are they calm under pressure? Can they communicate effectively? Those kinds of things. And I see from Rena through Nisa, able to communicate effectively as to what my requirements would be. So those are great things. So it's just really important in this process of sort of reflecting and thinking about advanced care planning, again, what those qualities are, because we will see in just a minute here that there is in fact legislation in BC around who could actually make decisions for you, because it can't just be, Bob down the street, right? There is legislation, and there is an actual hierarchy that we will talk about. But as important as knowing who that person might be is the consideration of who that person is and what some of their strengths are, because one of our other colleagues always says, deciding on who might be a substitute decision maker isn't a love competition. It's not about who you love the best or who you think loves you the best. It's really also considering some of those important qualities we talked about. So that person is called a substitute decision maker. And again, it's that person who would be making those decisions on our behalf. And though we call it a substitute decision maker, we also like to think about it. Sorry, there's my alarm. We also like to think about it as a substitute decision communicator, essentially, because it is one of the key qualities of a substitute decision maker is that they are reflecting your wishes. And in order for them to do that effectively, there needs to be communication about what those wishes are, which we will also talk about. And we've talked about a little bit already. So this is the list. This is the hierarchy, the medical treatment hierarchy that is set out. And it is firm in that this is something that healthcare providers do need to follow. So again, as great as your neighbor Bob is, he is not going to be very high up on that list in terms of someone who would make a decision in the event you were unable to make it for yourself. So just to go through the list a little bit here, and I'll move through a little bit quickly just in the interest of time. But number one on that list, of course, is capable adult, and that means all of us. So we are presumed capable under the law in BC of making our own healthcare decisions unless and until proven otherwise. So provided that we are able to communicate and understand, it is always going to be us who makes our own medical decisions. But the rest of that hierarchy is in the event that we can't, again, make our own decisions. So if that happens, the healthcare provider needs to consider whether or not the person has in place something called a comity of person. That is a legal document. It is very rare. We don't see them very often in healthcare. Where those come to be sometimes is in a situation where somebody has lost their capability or they've lost their competency for some reason. And it's perhaps too late to get some of these other things in place. And so there's a process by which somebody needs to be appointed actually through the Supreme Court as a comity, particularly if there's lots of decisions that need to be made So there's two types of comity. There's comity of person, so that's making healthcare decisions and personal care decisions. And there is something else called comity of estate, which would allow someone to manage someone's legal and financial affairs. Because if somebody needs to get a power of attorney, as Laura mentioned earlier, which of course in BC only extends to the legal and financial authority, somebody needs to be capable. You need to be able to understand the power and the authority that you're giving to someone else to manage your legal and financial affairs. So if you've gone, let's say you have a dementia and you're advancing in your disease and you're no longer able to understand the authority that you're giving to someone in that regard, that is the situation sometimes where a comity comes about. And it's a process where there's doctors involved that, weigh in on someone's capability. So it's not very often we see that. The other one there is representative, which Laura touched on a little bit. There's those two types of representatives under a Representation Agreement Act, and that's a Rep 7 and a Rep 9, which again were those documents that you can do in the back of that My Voice book. And some people do in fact go to a lawyer and get those done. But again, I want you to think about as we go through the temporary substitute decision maker part of this list, what your own situation is and whether or not you might actually consider a representation agreement because your list does not fit with the list that is set out in BC law. So before we get there, the last one there is advance directive. We are required to follow an advance directive. Laura touched on that where she referenced often it is a directive that comes into play if somebody knows in advance that there is a specific decision that they do not want to be made. Again, the example of say a refusal of a blood transfusion because it is not compatible with somebody's religious beliefs. That can be stated on an advance directive. And of course, it may never come into effect because that situation may never present for that person. But if someone's particularly concerned about that, they might want to go that route and get an advance directive and clearly state that that is something that they would not wish to have. But they're not that common in healthcare either, but they are out there. But for most of us, we're going to be in that next section, which is temporary substitute decision maker. And that is the list that, again, that is the other part of that list that we follow as healthcare providers. So if somebody is not capable of making their own decision, there's no comity in place, and there's no representative, and there's no advance directive, the healthcare providers then consider this next list in terms of who would be the person that we would contact to make that decision. And we actually go down that list exactly in that order. And that is the case for most of us, because most of us don't have those other 4 things that I just mentioned in place, 3 things, I guess. So understandably, under that list, the first person that the healthcare team would look to make a decision would be your spouse. And that can be a common law spouse. You don't have to be living together with somebody for 2 years. There's nothing like that. It's the person that is really just identified as a partner or a spouse. That also includes somebody of the same gender. Next on that list is your adult children. So they need to be 19 and older. The thing to note here is in brackets, it says equally ranked, meaning your oldest child does not have more say. Let's say the firstborn does not have more say than the middle child or the youngest child. All children, all adult children that are qualified are considered to be equally ranked, which is where it can get a little bit tricky, and I'll come back to that. Parent, same thing. If you're a young person and you're in that situation, and it would be your parent, one of your parents who would be next on the list there. And they also are equally ranked. So mom doesn't have more say than dad. And then same thing for brother or sister, the grandparents, the grandchildren, anyone else related by birth or adoption, a close friend you might want to note is down at the list there because that comes up a lot. People will say, you know what, I'm not sure that my spouse would be the best person under those circumstances. So I might consider having my best friend. Our lovely colleague, Nicole, mentions that quite a bit because in her situation, she has a very close nurse friend who would be the appropriate person for her. And then a person immediately related by marriage as well. So that's often who we think of when we think about in-laws, for example. And then at the very bottom of the list is our substitute decision maker of last resort, and that is a person appointed by the public guardian and trustee. We don't see that very often, but as social workers, we probably see that more than any other healthcare provider, because we're typically the one that needs to sort those pieces out and ensure that we get somebody to act in that capacity and make a healthcare decision for someone if we cannot determine that there's anybody else in that list. So the reason I mentioned thinking about that as it applies to your own situation is because for a lot of us, quite truthfully, that works out just okay. For me, I don't have a committee, I don't have a representation agreement or an advance directive. I have a spouse who I've been with for many, many years who knows me inside out. We've had these conversations because I've been in healthcare a long time, and he would be the person that would make that decision for me. So I don't need to actually go that extra step and make a representation agreement, if that makes sense. Now, if I was in Nicole's situation, and I hope you don't mind, Nicole, I'm highlighting you here. Nicole would think about that a little bit differently and consider a representation agreement, for example, because you can see that her husband is very high on that list. And so in the absence of having a separate rep agreement that lays out her close friend as the person she would want, her husband would actually be that person that makes that decision. Oops, sorry, getting queued up on the time. So I know that's kind of rushed, and I know that's a lot of information. I think I'll scoot through to the next few slides, and then hopefully we'll have a minute to maybe come back to that at the end. And I'm just looking at the chat, and I see that Laura's answering some questions, so thank you so much. So on the substitute decision makers, again, really quickly, in addition to who fits within that list that we just talked about, in addition, that person also needs to meet the qualifications of a substitute decision maker. So they must be 19. So I have a 20-year-old son at home. So in my situation, if my husband for some reason could not act in that capacity and be my voice for healthcare decisions, the next person on that list actually would be my son, my adult son, which is a bit scary and makes me think I need to have some some conversations, because I'm not so sure my 20-year-old son would be well positioned. But I joke, because actually we have had these conversations only because I do this role and I know how important it is. That person also needs to be willing and capable. So that's the other thing. Sometimes people can certainly pass over that responsibility. So another quick scenario, my grandmother had Alzheimer's. She had one son, that's my dad. My dad was not really comfortable acting in that capacity, making decisions for her towards the end of her life when she could no longer communicate. And because I'm in healthcare, he felt he wanted to basically pass that over to me. And that was no problem, right? There was no conflict. It wasn't me saying, I need to make decisions because I know better than my dad. It wasn't that kind of a situation. So that's, again, not a situation where we needed to go out and make a rep agreement because there was going to be an issue with that order. It was just fine. So someone needs to be willing and capable. They also need to not have a dispute or a conflict in the past 12 months. And they also need to be in contact with that person in the past 12 months. So lots of us have people living in different places, other provinces and things like that. That's okay. That's not a barrier. It's just contact, any contact, email, texting, as long as somebody hasn't been gone for the last 10 years, then, like you say, they meet within those qualifications. Number one, responsibility of a substitute decision maker, communicator, again, is that they are legally obligated to honor the person's wishes. So this is not about them making decisions that they think would be best. This is about them acting as your voice. And that's what's a really, really important thing to consider. And next slide, Laura. And so number 4 is talk. And this, of course, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, and Laura's touched on this nicely already earlier as well. It's just really having those conversations, and also just making sure that we don't make assumptions, because I think it's easy to do, that people understand our wishes better than they might. And this goes for us as healthcare providers as well. This whole exercise of advanced care planning, at the root of it, the core of it, is improving communication between families, opening up these dialogues, having these conversations with your healthcare providers, approaching your healthcare providers about these conversations. And then, as Laura mentioned, we also, part of our role is to educate healthcare providers and encourage healthcare providers to open up conversations with patients and families around these important conversations. So having the conversation is really important. And again, not making assumptions that we know exactly what someone would want, even if they're close to us. My husband and I, again, have had these conversations. Some of the things that he said has surprised me. I might have thought he would make a different decision. So the talking part is really, really key. And next slide. And again, thinking about, again, who those people are that give you strength and support, who are the people that you trust to share this information with and have these conversations. I think we all know who those people are, but we don't often necessarily, take the time to be intentional about thinking through who those people might be in our life. And next slide. So just a few tips here about opening up these conversations. Obviously, all of us are really unique. Every family is unique in terms of how open we might be about some of these conversations, but they can certainly be a tricky conversation to open up for some of us. So these are just a few ways to kind of think about approaching that conversation. You can think about approaching it from maybe a values type approach. So something like, I want to talk with you about what is important to me. Even though I'm okay right now, I'm worried that in the future, my diabetes might advance. I might have decisions to make around things like dialysis, and I want us to be prepared. A health approach might be something like, I would like you to go to medical appointments with me. I was thinking about what happened with Aunt Mary. And it made me realize how important it is to have someone along when I go to see my specialist. Substitute decision maker. Can you and I have a conversation about what matters most to me? I want you to be prepared if you had to make decisions for me or on my behalf. And support. Will you help me think about my future? I think it's really important that all of the family understand my wishes. And that's another really important point. If you have multiple children, for example, again, remember they're equally ranked. What's most important to really offset that possibility of potential conflict, if a situation ever arises in the future, is to make sure that everybody understand what matters to you. Because again, it's not so much about who that person is in that hierarchy that makes that decision. It's about them knowing what matters to you and everybody understanding what matters to you, so that there is not a dispute over this, going this route with that medical treatment or that route, because you have, to the best of your ability, explained what your values are and talked about it and had these conversations. And then lastly is recording step, of course. That talking and all these other steps we've talked about are so important, but unfortunately they can be lost if there is not some kind of a way for us to have this information recorded somewhere. Recording does not necessarily mean a 20-page document of advanced care planning information. It can simply be something, thank goodness a lot of us have our trusty phones these days. We don't have to go and set up a camcorder and make some kind of formal recording. We can, hit record on our phone and record a little snippet of information. So something like that, something very easy and not so cumbersome, can actually come in handy. We as healthcare providers know, and part of the reason that I'm actually was so enthusiastic to move into this job and this role is because I was a social worker in long-term care for a number of years. And I saw the difference between people who had actually gone through some of the advanced care planning process, not even necessarily all these steps, but just at least opened the conversation with family, particularly adult children, spouses, and healthcare providers, at least had some foundation and grounding for some of these thoughts and wishes and values. and ideally recorded some of this information. Just the difference between having that information, especially as a healthcare provider when these situations did come up, and those who had never considered this and who had never had these conversations. And now there's squabbling going on and there's distress for families. And there's sometimes distress for healthcare providers too, because we're left sometimes in a situation where we're kind of having to troubleshoot and make decisions, you know, or try to consider what might be best for somebody and communicate with families, and there's conflict and nobody's necessarily clear on what would have been the right choice. So, so the documentation part of it, the recording advanced care planning is really important. Some of the things to think about as you record are, again, goals. What am I looking forward to? What can I not imagine living without? What are some of the fears and worries about my future health, particularly if you do have a disease, a specific disease on board? That's where it's really important to have those conversations too with healthcare providers and family. Again, I mentioned dialysis, for example. So somebody that might have an issue or a chronic kidney disease might really need to think ahead about what that kidney disease might look like in the future, and what are some of those treatments that might pop up for me, and then have some conversation and get as much information as you're comfortable getting and discussing, just to think in advance about what those treatments might be. And strengths and priorities, what or who brings me strength and support? And again, who would be my choice of person to speak for me? And this little workbook here, we showed you the yellow workbook, which is that one that we said came out from the Ministry of Health. Well, this wonderful team before I joined actually created this other one here, which is on the screen here. It's probably easier for you to see it there. But I personally am a big fan of this book as a social worker, because it is a really helpful and tangible resource where it just guides you through these 5 steps that we've talked about today. And you can go and you can put pen to paper, you can start to think about those questions and jot things down. And there you go, you have your running advanced care plan started. So it's a really great resource that we can make sure we get out to you. And there's a little thing at the bottom there, we call that a green sleeve. That might be something that some of you are familiar with. That looks like this. And Laura's showing a copy of it with 2 of our important Fraser Health brochures in there around CPR. That is intended, it's got little magnets on the back, and it's intended to stick on your fridge. And it's basically somewhere to house some of these important things that we've talked about. So even a temporary substitute decision maker list that you can fill out yourself based on that hierarchy. That is actually in this workbook. You can go through and start to put people down. We also reference things like medication lists, for example. So important things related to advanced care planning can go in that little brochure, and it can be stuck up on your fridge, particularly if you live alone. And first responders in Fraser Health, the paramedics, are aware of that green sleeve, and they understand that it includes important information in there. So that is something that we can get out to folks as well. The other use for it sometimes is people will just, even if you don't have it on your fridge, because you know, not everybody wants it necessarily on their fridge, but you can actually put information in there and just use it as a little bit of a folder to bring to doctor's appointments. As you start to think about advanced care planning and start to hopefully maybe engage a healthcare provider in some of your conversations and your needs for information as well. And I think if you just, yeah, our last slide here is really just this planning wisdom, which is good plans shape good decisions. And I know that's rushed, and that's a lot of information that we've provided in a short snippet of time here. But I hope that it's at least a bit of an overview for everybody, and a bit more information about what advanced care planning actually means, and just reinforcing that advanced care planning is not just, again, for for somebody who's making these, specific medical decisions at the end of life, but rather an ongoing process throughout our lifespan. And we hope and we encourage and we're promoting advanced care planning for folks that are young and healthy to start planting the seed and thinking about some of these important things. Yes, and then also this is our contact information here. So if there's questions or comments, we are open to the public for information and support, and our phone number is there, as well as our website. And I've been talking and not monitoring the chat, so I know we're over time here, but certainly open it up to anybody for any last minute kind of questions that anybody might have.
I know I wasn't able to get to all the questions in the chat too, so
Okay.
I know I can't speak for Sherry and Nicole, but I can stick around a little bit longer if people have questions they want covered. I know there's been a lot of really good questions in the chat too. So should we start with Carl?
Are you sending a video copy to everyone, or is it available for this session?
Hi, Carl. I will be emailing it to you.
Oh, perfect. All
Yeah.
right, thank you.
No worries.
Good.
There was just a question in the chat from Bridget. Wouldn't first responders need who and how to contact rather than your values, etc.?
It's a great question. It's a great query, Bridget. And but I would say both are important for sure. Both are important. Yes, we need the who, because as you are alluding to there, if you are in a situation, of course, where you can't make that decision, yes, the who is important. So that contact list, as I said, is actually included in this booklet too. And again, keep in mind, there are folks out there who've done something like a rep agreement, because again, those might be the folks that might that temporary substitute decision maker list might not work for them. So they might in their situation have a representation agreement. If they do, it would be important to have a copy of that as well, because that would tell us as healthcare providers and first responders who our contact person is, who our representative is, along with their contact information. So yes, both are really important things to think about. And just while I remember too, I wanted to highlight the word temporary in that list. So unlike a committee or a representative under a rep agreement, sorry, it's wordy. Every time there is a medical treatment that needs to be made, a decision that needs to be made, they have to go to back to that temporary list, because it's just because somebody makes a decision on behalf of someone for a particular treatment, it's not that person is your permanent substitute decision maker. It's on a case by case basis, right? A treatment by treatment type basis. Just wanted to clarify that.
And just to add to what Sherry's saying about Bridget's question with the first responders. So I was just going to show you a couple things I have in my own green sleeve, which I have on the fridge. This list here, it says my temporary substitute decision maker list, because I don't have a representation agreement. I pulled this out. I think this one I actually pulled out of the My Voice booklet, but it's also in that workbook that Sherry was showing you. And I put a link to in the chat. And it lists off all the people that are in my world in here. And I just ripped it out. It's one page. It's got some information about me, and I've stuck that in there so that whoever needs to look after me has contact numbers. I also have a joy list in there, just so that people are aware of really bring into my life. And then I've got contacts for, I think right now I just have contacts for my dentist, but yeah, any consistent other healthcare providers, I put that information in here as well. There was another question I wanted to touch on. I'm just going back up the chat, sorry everyone. I did put in 2 links in the chat box there, one for the workbook that Sherry was showing you, one for it's called the easy read version. So it's essentially the same book with all the same information, but there's more pictures, and it's a good one if someone might process information a little bit differently, and maybe they've got a caregiver that's supporting them or a partner supporting them. so that you can work on the workbook together. So those two links you can go to through our patient education, which is accessible to the public. And you can either order through there online, or you can download and just have it filled out. It's a fillable PDF that you can fill out online on your computer. The other question that I don't think I answered was, so this was from Mary Lou. I'm not sure if Mary Lou's still on. Yes, she is. Okay, great. So for the substitute decision maker as the last resort, so I'm assuming this is the public guardian and trustee. Who would another person be appointed, and how does that work? So a healthcare provider only goes to the public guardian and trustee if we can find nobody else. And so, because sometimes we need consent for treatment, maybe not necessarily an emergency, because if it's an emergency and it's life-threatening, healthcare providers are just going to provide the care, unless otherwise having information that it's not something that the person wants. But if there's a little bit of time and we can't find anyone in that person's world, we'll go to the public guardian trustee. And the first question they're going to ask is, what do we know about this person? You know, what type of information do we have that tells us how this person would have made decisions for themselves if they could speak? So that's tends to be what happens when we're actually going to the public guardian for consent from them. Now, sometimes what happens is, even though we might be going to the public guardian trustee for that individual treatment consent request, they're still in the background, because we all work in teams, to try and find someone in this person's world, whether it be a friend, maybe it's a neighbor, someone that they might be in connection with. And sometimes what ends up happening is, maybe there was a neighbor that was just on vacation and they've come back, they realize, oh no, this person's in hospital. And so all of a sudden they show up. Or sometimes there's a person in connection that just is out of province and hasn't heard anything. Usually it's the social worker that ends up doing a lot of this work, but we end up doing a lot of research to try to figure out, where can we find a person that knows this patient very, very well, that's in their world, that the person does trust, to come in and provide support and consent while this person isn't able to speak for themselves. So there is a lot of work and sleuthing. It's another hat you could say that some social workers and nurses have, is we're a little bit of a private eye trying to find the people in this person's world. Does that answer your question, Mary Lou? Not sure.
Anyone else have any questions? Anybody else that's left on the line?
We do have questions about how to get booklets and green sleeves. So that, if you want us to mail you some of that information, we do have a mailing package. Send us an email that's on your screen there, or give us a call and if you give us a call, leave your phone number and we'll call you back and sort out what information you need and be able to mail that to you. If you email us, feel free to leave your mailing address and we can have that sent out to you. And that involves green sleeves, the My Voice booklet, the workbook, if that's something that you are interested in.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we're available for follow-up. So if you're enthusiastic about this and you get your booklet and you start in on it, but you start to, have some questions or just need some clarity, we certainly, are available for you to reach out and ask questions. We do get questions from the public, and we're happy to help you work through that.
Yeah, so, okay, we've got a couple questions coming in.
Oh.
Thank you, Mary Lou. She says, thanks so much for the great presentation. I also attended the Peace Arch Hospice presentation on May 25th, taken many programs about this, and the slides are really awesome now. Thank you. So thank you, Mary Lou. If you do have more specific questions, or if you have a scenario that you want clarified in terms of your other question, feel free to email us and we can see what we can help you with in terms of that one. Bridget asked, do you know if Surrey Memorial Hospice keeps the most forms on file, especially in emergency? So yes, we do have an internal documentation system. So the idea is that when a physician, whether they're in acute care, whether they're in the community, and they fill out a most form, they need to fax it in to a specific spot. There's a fax number on the bottom of the form that they fill out, and it goes to health records, and then someone within health records uploads that into our documentation systems so that it can be pulled up in an emergency if we don't have something physically tangible in hand when the person comes into the emergency room. Is there anything else that Nicole or Sherry wants to add to that? No. Does that answer your question, Bridget? How long do they keep them? They usually sit on our file. I believe it's like 7 or 9 years that stays in our system. Does that sound right, Nicole, Sherry? Like it's just scanned into our documentation system, so it sits there. But they're all dated so that if there is a more recent document, then that's what ends up being followed. And usually the physicians need to review that information every year for updates. So if we've got something on file that's 5 years old, then the doctors are going to need to deal with that and have some conversations, because there should never be anything that's old on file in terms of the most form.
Yeah. And presumably, of course, when people are coming into the acute care setting, there's some reason, there's something that's brought them in. So somebody's, health situation is changing, and that's also a trigger, of course, for healthcare providers to revisit what's going on. Everybody living in Fraser Health settings, like long-term care, for example, has a medical order for scope of treatment sitting on their file as well. And those are revisited through case conferences and changing health conditions and yearly reviews, even when people are stable. So it's a working document that should be revisited as well, but it's a good question.
And let me see, Marco asked, I wonder how I'd find out about my estate plans without a lawyer. In terms of estate plans, that's not quite within our scope. I don't know if Nicole or Sherry knows anything from more of a personal level. I know I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, and I would say the same, because our focus is, of course, on the healthcare legislation, and that's primarily our focus. But I wonder if the question is coming about if there's just a sort of, it sounds like it's maybe a query around can I do estate planning without a lawyer? That might be kind of what the question is. And again, I wouldn't be able to give you any real concrete information there. I mean, Nicole did tell us at the beginning there just a little bit about if you don't have significant assets, property and things like that, that there might be some opportunities there. But most estate plans, generally speaking, of course, do involve a lawyer, and particularly if there's a house or there's assets. And by estate plans, I'm assuming, you're talking wills and things of that nature, which do typically involve lawyers. So. Yeah. So I don't know if there's any other. Dr. Google, Marco says, yes. Oh boy, hey, Dr. Google. What would we do without Dr. Google?
It's a blessing and a
Good, the
curse.
bad,
We
and the
have
ugly, right?
both
Yeah.
way too much information and not enough information all through Dr. Google at once.
Exactly, exactly. Within 5 minutes, we've all been diagnosed with about 5 different diseases and yeah.
Thanks for coming, Corey.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like everybody, yeah, I mean, we're still here for a minute. If anybody has any other questions, hopefully we've answered them. And then again, just keep in mind, if you want some of the resources and stuff to be sent out and then need some support, we're here for that too.
Mhm. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email, so I'll include all of your contact information in there as well, in case anybody would like to reach out, just as a little reminder. And if you have any additional questions that come up, feel free to reach out to them as well. But thank you so much, Laura, Sherry, and Nicole. That was amazing, as always. And I will be sending the recording of this after the event. And if you have any other questions, please do reach out. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you again.
Thank you for having us.
Great, yes, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lisa.
Take care, everyone.